All right, ready to explore something kind of personal and often, well, misunderstood, marriage and family, but through the lens of the Quran. We're going deeper than the usual sound bites, right? We're really going to uncover the nuances, and for this deep dive, our guide is Dr. Abla Hasan and her work, Marriage in the Quran.
You know, it's so interesting how many preconceived notions people bring to the table when it comes to the Quran's stance on marriage. They've often absorbed these external narratives instead of really engaging with the text itself. And that's where Dr. Hassan is such a fantastic guide. She gently brings us back to the source material and encourages, like, a fresh perspective.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. Dr. Hassan, she tackles these really sensitive issues, right? But she does it with this critical, yet super respectful approach. It's all about the textual analysis, the historical context, really understanding the Quran on its own terms. And she starts by highlighting how the Quran uses this word mithaq to describe marriage. Now, we often see it translated as contract, but Dr. Hassan pushes back on that, saying it misses some of its depth.
Exactly. Contract, it feels kind of, I don't know, transactional.
Huh.
And mythos signifies something much deeper. It's a sacred covenant, more akin to the bond between, say, God and the prophets.
Wow, okay, so that's a huge difference.
It elevates marriage from just this, practical agreement to something deeply spiritual, a real commitment. And it's a stark contrast to, say, pre-Islamic Arabia, where marriage was often seen through that more, well, transactional lens. It was about property, social alliances, that kind of thing.
So the Quran is reframing marriage, making it this sacred promise, and that changes things, right? It
Yeah.
suggests a deeper level of responsibility in upholding that bond. It's not just about, like, individual gains anymore.
Exactly, and that ties into this concept of tranquility that is so central to how the Quran views a fulfilling marriage. Verse 30.21 beautifully captures this, emphasizing not just like coexisting, but really thriving together in a partnership rooted in peace and mutual fulfillment.
And this idea of tranquility, it feels especially relevant when you think about the Quran's guidance on intimacy within marriage, right? It goes beyond just like a list of rules and offers something much more nuanced. Like take verse 2.223, for example.
Yeah.
It's often misinterpreted, I'd say, simplified into this crude analogy about a husband tending his field.
Right, and reducing such a nuanced verse to just the physical act really misses the point. Dr. Hassan really stresses the significance of that phrase, send something good ahead before intimacy. It's about creating this atmosphere of anticipation, mutual desire. It's about so much more than just the physical act itself. Think, gestures of affection, thoughtful words, any act of care that shows genuine consideration for your partner.
So it's about fostering emotional connection,
Yeah.
recognizing that intimacy thrives on mutual respect and understanding. And maybe this is just me, but it always seemed like the responsibility to set the stage, so to speak, fell more on women. But this challenges that assumption.
Absolutely. This verse is directly addressing men, highlighting their role in cultivating a fulfilling intimate life for both partners. And again, it circles right back to that core idea of tranquility. It's not just about avoiding conflict, it's about actively seeking mutual fulfillment in all facets of a marriage, especially the most intimate ones.
Wow. Yeah, that adds a whole other dimension to how we understand intimacy in the context of marriage. Now let's talk about another topic that often gets, well, misinterpreted, I guess.
Sure.
The age of marriage in Islam. There's always debate surrounding the Quran's stance on this, especially when you bring up Aisha's age at her marriage to the Prophet Muhammad.
And this is where Dr. Hassan's analysis really challenges some of those traditional interpretations. She points to verses like 24.59 and 4.6, which offer a different perspective on when someone is truly ready for marriage.
Because simply reaching puberty doesn't necessarily equip you for the complexities of married life, right? And what I find fascinating is how Dr. Hassan links this to the whole idea of marriageable age. It's not just about physical maturity, it's also about sound judgment.
It's exactly. Verse 24.59, it differentiates between reaching puberty and possessing the maturity needed for marriage. And verse 4.6, it ties the ability to handle one's personal affairs, including marriage, to having that sound judgment. Dr. Hassan argues that this distinction, it's not just a small detail, it reframes how we view marriage in the Quran. It's about the union of two responsible adults, not just two people who've hit puberty.
Which then challenges this misconception that Islam condones child marriage, right? Instead, it emphasizes mental and emotional readiness alongside the physical development.
It provides a much-needed, nuanced understanding, challenging those interpretations that are really rooted in the social norms of a completely different era. It highlights how crucial it is to understand these sensitive topics within their proper context.
Absolutely. And speaking of context, I'm fascinated by Dr. Hassan's breakdown of maruf. Often it's translated simply as obedience, right? But within a marriage, it carries a much deeper meaning.
Oh, for sure. Maruf is so much more than blind obedience. It speaks to fairness, kindness, upholding the highest ethical standards within a community. It's about treating your partner with unwavering dignity, respect, and consideration. And that's important throughout a marriage, even when things get tough.
So it's not just about, like, following the rules. It's about actively creating a just and loving environment. This concept of maruf, it seems deeply connected to how the Qur'an emphasizes respect and justice, even, or maybe especially, in situations of conflict.
Absolutely. And this emphasis extends to how the Quran addresses those difficult situations, like when disagreements inevitably arise within a marriage. It's a theme that runs through Dr. Hassan's analysis of certain verses, especially some that have been, well, let's just say they've been misinterpreted to justify some pretty harmful things.
That's such an important point to emphasize, this idea that the Qur'an really does prioritize justice and respect, especially within marriage. And it makes me think of verse 4.128. It's one that's often interpreted in a way that suggests women should just tolerate mistreatment from their husbands.
Oh, absolutely. 4.128 is a perfect example of how interpretations can be, well, manipulated, twisted to fit a certain narrative. The verse mentions a wife fearing new shoes from her husband, but it also uses this term ira, and that adds a whole other layer of meaning.
Right, we talked about new shoes earlier, that sense of, like, high-handedness or transgression. So what does ira bring into the picture?
Ira suggests neglect, like emotional withdrawal, a lack of care and attention from the husband. Dr. Hassan, she really highlights this term to show that the Quran recognizes harm isn't just about what you do, but also what you don't do.
So it acknowledges that emotional neglect, it can be just as damaging as any kind of physical abuse.
Exactly. And I guess the more traditional interpretation often encourages women to just endure that kind of treatment, to prioritize the marriage staying intact, even if it means sacrificing their own well-being. Like a woman's value is tied to her being married, even at the cost of her own happiness, which is...
Yeah, it's kind of disheartening. But Dr. Hassan's interpretation, it feels, I don't know, more empowering.
Absolutely. She argues that 4.128, it's actually encouraging women to seek a peaceful settlement if they are facing nushuz or ira. It's not about enduring abuse, it's about actively trying to work towards a resolution, one that's based on communication, compromise, mutual respect.
It's like it reframes the entire narrative. It empowers women to advocate for themselves, to seek a just and equitable solution instead of just suffering in silence.
Exactly. It flips that traditional interpretation on its head. And it's interesting, right? Because this verse, it comes right after 4.34, which we talked about before. And Dr. Hassan's analysis, it shows how those verses, when you understand them in their proper context, they actually work together to promote justice and safeguard women's rights, not just within the community, but within their marriages, too.
I love how she connects those dots. It's so illuminating. It really shows how many misconceptions arise when you don't look at the interconnectedness of the Quran's verses.
Yeah.
Okay, on to a topic that I think dominates a lot of conversations about Islam and marriage, polygamy.
Polygamy, yeah. It's so often automatically linked to Islam and also often misunderstood and frankly misrepresented. Dr. Hassan, she makes this really important distinction between what she calls Islamic polygyny and Quranic polygyny.
Okay, because for most people, when they hear polygamy in the context of Islam, they think of a man having multiple wives, which, brings up all these ideas of jealousy, competition between the wives. Is that what Dr. Hassan is referring to as Islamic polygyny?
Yes, exactly. Islamic polygyny, as a term, it reflects that common and often distorted understanding and practice of polygamy that we see in some Muslim communities today. It's different from Quranic polygyny, which is, it's a very different concept.
So what makes Quranic polygyny different?
Quranic polygyny, as Dr. Hassan lays it out, it's highly specific, very conditional, and it's a far cry from that common perception we were just talking about. She emphasizes that polygamy, according to the Quran, it's only permissible in a very specific context, and that context is the care of orphans.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's not just about a man who, wants to have multiple wives.
Not at all. Dr. Hassan argues that verse 4.3, which is often used to justify polygamy, It's actually addressing a very specific social concern of the time, which was ensuring the well-being of orphans. Especially, in a society where you had a lot of children who had lost their fathers due to wars, conflicts. It was about creating a stable family structure for those vulnerable children. And even then, it was incredibly conditional.
What kind of conditions are we talking about?
Well, for starters, it wasn't just up to men to decide, okay, the community, they had to approve, and it was only allowed if there was a genuine concern that, these orphans weren't being properly cared for.
So there had to be a demonstrated need, and community oversight was essential.
Yes, exactly. And on top of that, the Quran sets this incredibly high standard of fairness that men must uphold if they were to have multiple wives.
Which, I mean, given the complexity of human relationships, it sounds almost impossible to truly achieve, right?
And that's exactly Dr. Hasan's point. Verse 4.129, it actually acknowledges how difficult, how near impossible it is to treat multiple wives equally, no matter how hard someone might try. It highlights how there's always a potential for imbalance, for one wife to feel maybe less valued.
So it's almost like a cautionary message in some way.
Right, like, hey, this is serious, this is hard. Maintaining true fairness in this dynamic is, well, it's incredibly difficult. And this is where that distinction between Islamic polygyny and Quranic polygyny becomes really clear. Dr. Hasan argues that the way polygamy is often practiced today, without those strict rules, with people justifying it for all sorts of reasons, it distorts what the Quran originally intended.
So what was meant to be this very specific conditional exception, something intended to protect vulnerable children, it morphed into this more generalized practice.
Exactly. And that's why engaging directly with the Quran's language, with its historical context, it's so crucial. If we rely solely on interpretations that have been passed down without ever questioning them, without really understanding their origins, well, we risk perpetuating practices that might actually contradict the Quran's true message.
Wow, yeah, that is definitely something to think about. It makes you wonder, right? If polygamy is a good example of this, what other practices have we accepted without really understanding where they came from and what their true intention was?
It's a question worth asking ourselves, for sure. It highlights the importance of critical thinking, of questioning what we think we know, of always striving for a deeper understanding of our faith.
Absolutely. And speaking of seeking a deeper understanding, in the final part of this deep dive, we're going to explore Dr. Hasan's analysis of how, this misinterpretation of orphans in 4.3 really contributed to the acceptance of, less restrictive forms of polygamy that are practiced today. So don't go anywhere. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into marriage in the Quran with Dr. Abla Hasan. We've been untangling this whole idea of polygamy and how it's so often misconstrued, and you left us on a bit of a cliffhanger, talking about how even the word orphans in verse 4.3 has been, misinterpreted in a way that allows for these less restrictive forms of polygamy that we see today.
Yeah, it's a point of contention for sure, and Dr. Hasan, she really dissects it brilliantly. See, I guess you could say the traditional take on 4.3, it often presents it as this blanket permission slip, right? Like, as long as a man can treat his wives fairly, he can marry up to 4. And it often kind of glosses over that part in 4.129 that we talked about, where it basically says achieving that true equity, it's nearly impossible. But what Dr. Hasan does, she digs even deeper. She challenges the whole foundation of that interpretation by really examining that word orphans.
So it's not as straightforward as just marrying the mothers of orphans to, provide for those kids.
Yeah, right. It's more complicated than that. Dr. Hasan's argument is that this traditional interpretation, it broadens the definition of orphans so much that it basically includes any woman, which, removes that crucial link to caring for children who've actually lost their father.
That's quite a shift in meaning. So how does she back that up?
Well, she points to the actual language used in 4.3. The verse uses yatama, which is the masculine plural form, and includes both boys and girls, not yatimat, which would refer specifically to orphan girls.
Okay, that makes sense. But couldn't someone argue that even if it includes both genders, it's still talking about, marrying those orphan girls once they come of age?
It's a common counterargument, for sure. But Dr. Hasan, she dismantles that too. She points to 4.127, which very clearly uses Yatama al-Nisa when it's specifically talking about orphan girls who are of marriageable age.
So the Quran makes a clear distinction. Orphans, meaning fatherless children, and then orphan girls as a separate category.
Exactly. And that distinction, it matters, right? Because it shows that the Quran, it's using that term orphans in a very precise way. It's directly connected to that social issue of caring for vulnerable children, not as a loophole to just like allow for unrestricted polygamy.
It's amazing how a more nuanced understanding of the language can completely change how we understand a verse's intended purpose.
It's true. And unfortunately, by reinterpreting orphans in 4.3, those later interpretations, they inadvertently paved the way for the more widespread, less restrictive forms of polygamy that we see in some Muslim communities today. It's a deviation from that very specific language used in the Quran, and it has led to practices that, well, according to Dr. Hassan's analysis, really stray from the text's original intent.
It just really highlights, again, why Dr. Hassan's work is so important. This call to really engage directly with the Quran, to critically examine these interpretations that have been passed down, often without, much scrutiny.
It's a good reminder, right, that understanding the Quran, it's an ongoing process. It's about learning, questioning, reflecting, and approaching these discussions with, I think, with intellectual honesty and courage, because sometimes, blindly accepting interpretations, it can lead to practices that, well, they might contradict the very heart of the Quran's message.
Such a powerful message. And I think, for me, this entire deep dive has really just given us a lot to think about. It's a good reminder that interpreting any kind of sacred text, it requires us to really consider the language, the context, the historical background.
It's about engaging with our faith on a deeper level, always seeking a deeper understanding and being willing to have those difficult conversations, but doing it with humility and an open mind.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Dr. Abla Hasan's work, Marriage in the Quran, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What resonated with you? What questions are you wrestling with? Keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, and never stop seeking knowledge. Because I think, as Dr. Hasan so powerfully demonstrates, a nuanced understanding of the Quran, it can lead us to a richer, more meaningful relationship with our faith, with our relationships, with life itself.